Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood before the massive viewport of the Galactic Assembly Station and watched the stars shimmer against the darkness of space beyond. Concordia's orbit. She had traveled 3 months to reach this place, carrying with her the hopes of 8 billion humans who waited anxiously back on Earth for news of their first formal contact with the wider galactic community. The assembly chamber itself was a marvel of architecture that defied human engineering understanding. A circular room that seemed to stretch impossibly upward, with no visible ceiling and walls that shifted colors according to the mood of the speakers. 17 species had gathered here today, each one representing a civilization that had mastered space travel long before humanity had even invented the wheel. Alina adjusted her formal diplomatic uniform and checked the small quantum communicator hidden beneath her collar, a piece of technology that Earth scientists had developed in secret and one that the assembly knew nothing about. The insectoid creche delegates chittered among themselves in their clicking language as she entered, their compound eyes tracking her movement with what she could only interpret as contempt. The creche looked like enormous mantises, standing nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and exoskeletons that gleamed like polished obsidian. Under the chamber's strange lighting beside them sat the luminari, beings of living crystal whose bodies refracted light into cascading rainbows and who communicated through harmonic frequencies that human translators struggled to interpret accurately. The reptilian Sorcs lounged in their designated area with the casual arrogance of apex predators, their scaled bodies muscled and powerful, with eyes that tracked Alina the way a wolf might watch a rabbit. Only one representative seemed genuinely interested rather than hostile, an elderly archon named Keeper Theln, whose species resembled tall, thin humanoids with skin like weathered bark and eyes that held the depth of Centurious Thel, been the one to extend the invitation to Earth in the first place, though Alina was beginning to suspect there was more to that invitation than simple diplomatic courtesy. The chamber's central platform rose from the floor as Alina approached, and she stepped onto it with practiced confidence, despite the knot of tension in her stomach. Representatives of the Galactic Assembly, she began in clear, measured tones that the translation devices would carry to all present. I come before you as the voice of humanity and of Earth. We are young by your standards. Barely 50 years since our first ventures beyond our home world, she continued. But in that time we have established 7 thriving colonies and developed technologies that we believe could benefit all sentient species. The creche hive prince Exarth rose from his position with a scraping sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. Benefit. His translated voice buzzed with derision. What could a species of primitive scavengers possibly offer the assembly? Alina kept her expression neutral despite the insult and pulled up a holographic display that showed humanity's achievements in medical nanotechnology. Our doctors have eliminated over 300 diseases that once plagued our species, she explained, and our regenerative techniques could extend the lifespan of many carbon-based life forms by decades. A Luminari representative chimed in with harmonics that the translator rendered as skeptical curiosity. Your lifespans are already remarkably short by our standards. Do you not think it presumptuous to lecture your elders on longevity? Alina smiled slightly and shifted the display to show human engineering projects, massive space stations and terraforming operations that had transformed barren moons into garden worlds. We may be she acknowledged, but that makes us efficient, and we work with a passion born from knowing our time is limited. She continued her presentation for another hour, carefully revealing enough to demonstrate human capability while holding back critical information about Earth's defensive capabilities and the true extent of their colonial expansion. The questions from the assembly grew increasingly hostile as the presentation went on, and Alina recognized the pattern from her intelligence briefing back on Earth. They weren't interested in what humanity could offer, but rather in finding weaknesses they could exploit. Where exactly are these colony worlds located? Demanded a Sorcs general whose name translated as something like Blood. Scalina's training kicked in, and she deflected smoothly. Our colonies are located in regions we have designated as human space, and we would be happy to discuss trade routes through neutral territories. That was not an answer. Bloodscale hissed, "It was the answer you're going to receive," Elena replied calmly. "Humanity values our privacy just as I'm sure each of your civilizations values yours." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Elena saw several. Delegates exchanged meaningful glances. Exarth leaned forward with his mandibles clicking rapidly in what she had learned was a sign of aggressive intent among the Kresh. "Perhaps you misunderstand your position here." "Human," he said, with each word dripping with menace. "The Assembly does not make requests of potential member species. We provide guidance and oversight for the good of galactic stability. Guidance is appreciated," Elena said carefully. "But humanity seeks partnership as equals, not oversight as subordinates." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien voices, and translation devices struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations only. Keeper Thelm remained silent, and when Elena glanced his way, she saw something in his ancient eyes that might have been concern or perhaps admiration. Finally, Ixarth called for order, and the chamber fell silent. "Assembly will vote on whether to extend an offer of protective quarantine to humanity," he announced. "Such protection would ensure that you do not accidentally bring harm to yourselves or others through your inexperience with galactic affairs." Elena's blood ran cold, because she knew exactly what protective quarantine meant from the historical records Earth had managed to obtain through back channels. Every species that had accepted such an arrangement had effectively become a vassal state with their world stripped of resources and their people relegated to second-class citizenship. Humanity respectfully declines any such protection, she stated firmly. "We are quite capable of managing our own affairs. That remains to be seen," Exarth replied. "The vote will proceed regardless." As the delegates began their formal voting process, Elena activated her quantum communicator with a subtle gesture and sent a brief encrypted pulse back to Earth. The vote failed to pass, but only narrowly, with several species abstaining rather than supporting humanity's independence. Ixt looked distinctly displeased with the result, but forced his mandibles into what passed for diplomatic expression among his kind. "The Assembly grants you a recess period of 3 standard cycles to reconsider your position," he announced. "We suggest you use this time wisely." Elena bowed formally and retreated from the central platform with her heart pounding because she recognized a threat when she heard one. As she left the chamber, Keeper Thelm fell into step beside her with his long strides easily matching her pace. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said quietly, "might we speak privately?" Something in his tone made Elena nod, and she followed him to a small observation deck away from the main diplomatic areas. The old Archon gazed out at the stars for a long moment before speaking. "You should leave this station as soon as possible," he said without looking at her. "The Assembly has never invited a species to join peacefully." Elena felt her suspicions confirmed with cold certainty. Then why extend the invitation at all? "She asked to measure you," Thelm replied, "to see if you would come willingly to your own subjugation, or if you possessed the strength to resist. And what happens now that we've shown we'll resist?" Keeper Thelm finally turned to look at her, and his expression was grave. "Now they will demonstrate what happens to those who refuse the Assembly's generosity," he said. "I am sorry, Ambassador. I had hoped your species might be different, but the pattern has held for 3,000 years. Elena gripped the railing of the observation deck and made a decision. "Thank you for the warning, Keeper," she said, "but humanity doesn't run from bullies. We face them." The old Archon's expression might have been a smile. "That," he said softly, "is precisely what I was afraid you would say." Elena spent the next 2 days gathering information from every source she could find on the Concordia station, while maintaining the appearance of diplomatic compliance. Her small security detail led by Major Chen worked tirelessly to map the stations, lay out and identify potential escape routes if things went wrong. Major Chen was a compact woman of Chinese descent whose calm demeanor hid reflexes like a coiled spring and a tactical mind that had earned her command of Earth's first deep space. "Security force, something's not right," Ambassador Chen reported during their evening briefing in the human quarters. "Kresh military personnel have been moving through restricted sections and are monitoring equipment. Picked up unusual energy signatures near the docking bays." Alina nodded grimly because she had expected something like this keeper. Theln had provided her with historical records that painted a disturbing picture of the Assembly's true nature. Every single species that had joined the TC's assembly in the past millennium had done so only after being defeated militarily or after their leadership had been replaced with assembly-friendly collaborators. The so-called invitation process was merely theater designed to give the appearance of legitimacy to what was essentially galactic conquest. Species that resisted openly were crushed and their worlds occupied, while species that attempted to simply ignore the elite assembly found themselves subjected to economic warfare and systematic isolation until they had no choice but to submit. Alina had transmitted all of this information back to Earth through the quantum communicator along with her recommendation to withdraw their diplomatic mission and prepare for the worst. Earth's response had been brief and unsigned, but she recognized President Okaffer's phrasing in the message that came back: "Stand your ground. We will not abandon you." The words should have been comforting, but Alina knew what they really meant. That Earth's government believed this confrontation was inevitable, and had decided to face it now, rather than wait for the Assembly to choose the time and place. In the third day of the recess period, Keeper Theln contacted her again with a request to meet in one of the station's cultural exchange centers. Alina went with Major Chen and 2 other security personnel, despite knowing it might be a trap because Theln had proven himself the only honest voice among the Assembly delegates. The old Archon was waiting in a garden area that had been designed to showcase plant life from various Assembly worlds, and the riot of colors and strange geometries made Alina feel as if she had stepped into an alien painting. "I have something you need to see," Theln said without preamble, and handed her a data crystal. Alina inserted it into her portable terminal and felt her stomach drop as she reviewed the contents. The crystal contained military deployment orders issued by Hy-Vee Prince Xarth and countersigned by the Sorix and Luminari command structures. According to the orders, Kresh shock troops were to secure the human quarters at precisely midnight station time on charges of espionage and industrial sabotage. All human personnel were to be detained, and Ambassador Vasquez was specifically marked for termination, with her death to be presented as occurring during resistance to lawful arrest. "Why are you showing me this?" Alina asked. "Because I am tired," Theln said simply. "Tired of watching the Assembly destroy every species that shows promise, and tired of being complicit in their crimes. The Archons were once a proud people who valued knowledge and cooperation," he continued, "but we made the mistake of joining the Assembly willingly 3,000 years ago. By the time we understood what it truly was, we were too entangled to escape. If you know all this, then help us." Alina Ergatheln shook his head slowly. "I am one voice among hundreds, and my people are too dependent on Assembly infrastructure to risk rebellion," he said. "But I can give you time." "How much time?" "For hours," the old Archon replied. "I will trigger a false alarm in the western quadrant of the station that should draw away half of the Kresh forces assigned to take you." Alina gripped his arm in gratitude and then turned to Major Chen. "Get everyone ready to move," she ordered. "We're leaving now." Major Chen nodded crisply and spoke into her CUM unit, while Alina activated her quantum communicator one final time. The message she sent was longer than the previous ones and contained everything she had learned about the Assembly, including Keeper, Thelna's intelligence, and the historical records of their conquests. She ended with a simple statement: "They meant to kill us from the start. Don't let them get away with it." The reply from Earth came back almost instantly. "Understood. Hold position as long as possible to give us time to prepare." Alina closed her eyes briefly and then opened them with renewed determination. If Earth needed time, then she would buy it for them with whatever currency she had available. The human quarters were designed to house a delegation of 20 people, including diplomats, security personnel, and support staff. Alina gathered them all in the main common area and explained the situation with brutal honesty. "We have maybe 4 hours before the Kresh come for us. She said, "Earth wants us to hold out and buy time for whatever response they're planning. We can fortify this position," Major Chen said immediately. "The quarters have only 3 entry points, and the walls are reinforced for pressure containment." "Do it," Lena ordered. "Everyone who isn't essential to the defense needs to destroy all sensitive data and prepare." The communications equipment for emergency purge her people moved with efficient purpose, and Alina felt a surge of pride watching them work. These were the best humanity had to offer. Volunteers who had known the risks of first contact and had chosen to face them anyway. The fortification took 3 hours, and by the time Keeper Thelna's diversion triggered in the western quadrant, they were as ready as they could. Beatty false alarm worked exactly as promised, and they watched on security monitors as Kresh soldiers rushed away from their positions. But High Prince Exarth was evidently more cautious than Theln had anticipated, because he left a substantial force in place to secure the human quarters. At midnight station time, the remaining Kresh forces attacked Major Chen, positioned her people at strategic choke points, and the Kresh quickly discovered that humans in a defensive position were far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The first wave of attackers burst through the outer door with weapons ready, only to run straight into a kill zone that Chen had prepared with brutal efficiency. Human weapons cracked with sharp reports, and Kresh soldiers fell with smoking holes in their exoskeletons. Aliens had expected easy prey, but instead found themselves facing opponents who shot with frightening accuracy and who used tactics that seemed to anticipate every move they made. Lena coordinated the defense from the central command post, while simultaneously broadcasting everything through the quantum communicator, so Earth would have a complete record. The Kresh pulled back and regrouped after losing a dozen soldiers, and then came again with heavier weapons. This time, they breached the outer defenses through sheer firepower. But the humans fell back to prepared secondary positions and made them pay for every meter of corridor. Major Chen held the eastern approach with just 3 other soldiers, and for 7 minutes they created a graveyard of Kresh. Bodhi Zelina watched on the monitors as Chen moved like water between cover points and fired with mechanical precision, even as return fire chewed the walls around her to pieces. Chen, finally, fell. It was only after she had personally killed 31 enemy soldiers and given the rest of the defenders time to fall back to the final defensive position of Prince Zixarth himself came through the breached doors with his elite guard, and Alina knew the end had come. She destroyed the last of the communications equipment, except for the quantum transmitter, which she kept broadcasting, and then picked up a weapon from a fallen security officer. The final stand lasted 6 minutes. Alina fought with a fury born of rage and grief for her fallen people and managed to kill 4 Kresh soldiers before coming face to face with Ixarth himself. The Hive Prince was enormous up close, and his mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he advanced. "On her, you fought well for primitives," he said. "But this changes nothing." Elena's response was to fire her last rounds directly into his thorax, and then when the weapon clicked empty, she charged him with a vibroblade she had taken from a dead Kresh Day fight. Was brief and brutals. Sarth was stronger, but Alina was driven by something he couldn't understand. The absolute human refusal to submit even in the face of certain death. She managed to drive her blade through his primary breathing spiracle before his guards finally shot her down. As darkness closed in around her vision, Elena's last act was to trigger the quantum communicator's final protocol. Every piece of data, every moment of the battle, every crime the Assembly had committed was compressed into a single burst transmission that would reach Earth in seconds. Her last conscious thought was a hope that Earth would make them. Patha Assembly's official statement was released 6 hours later. The incident was described as a tragic misunderstanding caused by human aggression and cultural differences. Minimal reparations were offered, along with an invitation for Earth to send a new delegation to discuss the matter peacefully. The Assembly expected humanity to accept this fiction and quietly fade into irrelevance. Like so many species before them, they were about to learn that humans were very different from any species they had previously encountered. Earth's response to the Assembly's statement was silence, not the silence of shock or grief, but something far more ominous. The silence of a predator choosing its moment to strike. For 30 days no message came from human space and no diplomatic communication was answered. The Assembly's intelligence networks tried desperately to penetrate human territory, but found their spy ships turned away by newly deployed defensive platforms that appeared seemingly overnight. The Luminary High Council grew increasingly nervous as their long-range sensors picked up energy signatures from human space that suggested massive industrial mobilization. Worlds that had been producing civilian goods switched to military production, and the output was staggering impossible, declared Crystalline Mind who Ceasefar, the Luminary's chief strategic analyst. No species can retool their economy that quickly without causing societal collapse, but the humans were doing exactly that. Every colony world had shifted into war. Production and civilian populations had evacuated from border systems with an efficiency that spoke of long-held contingency plans. Assembly had assumed humanity would be paralyzed by the loss of their ambassador, but instead they moved with frightening coordination, as if Alina Vasquez's death had removed the last restraint holding them back. Sorik's military command watched the developments with predatory interest. General Bloodscale reviewed intelligence reports showing human fleet movements and felt a strange mixture of concern and excitement. They moved like hunters, he told his staff officers. See how they clear their territory of vulnerabilities before advancing? The Kresh Collective refused to take the threat seriously with Hive Prince Exarth dead his successor. Hive Lord Krethix dismissed human capabilities as propaganda designed to cover their weakness. They are mammals. Krethix buzzed to the Assembly Council, soft and emotional and prone to collapse when their leadership is eliminated. We eliminated their leader, and they did not collapse. Keeper Theln pointed out quietly. Then we will eliminate more, Krethix replied with absolute confidence on the 30th day. The humans finally broke their silence, not with words, but with action. 60 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Concordia system, and every sensor in assembly space locked onto them immediately. The human fleet was led by a massive dreadnought that outmassed anything the Assembly had seen humanity build before. Its hull was painted black with white letters that spelled out Elena's vengeance in English, and in every major assembly language Admiral James Kowalski transmitted his message on every frequency. The Assembly monitored. His voice was calm and professional, and all the more terrifying for it. I am Admiral Kowalski of the United Earth Defense Force, he said. 30 days ago you murdered Ambassador Elena Vasquez and 19 other members of her delegation. You did this not in honorable combat, but through treachery and assassination, he continued. You then attempted to hide your crime behind lies and false apologies. Humanity does not accept your apologies, and we do not accept your lies. We demand the immediate surrender of all personnel involved in the planning and execution of the Concordia massacre, Kowalski stated. We demand the complete dismantling of the Assembly's military forces and submission to war crimes tribunal's. Failure to comply will result in what we call comprehensive reprisal, he said. You have 12 hours to respond. The transmission ended, and the assembly chamber erupted into chaos. 12 hours. Krethix's mandibles clicked with incredulous fury. They send 60 ships and think to threaten the combined might of 17 civilizations. The Luminary Council was less dismissive. Their ships are larger than anticipated, Crystalline Mind reported, and their energy signatures suggest weapons. Systems we have not encountered before. Weapons mean nothing against superior numbers, Krethix insisted. I will dispatch 300 vessels to swat these insects, and then we will cleanse their homeworld as an example. Keeper Theln stood slowly, and his ancient voice cut through the arguing delegates. You are making a mistake, he said. Humans do not bluff, and they do not surrender. If they came with only 60 ships, then those 60 ships are sufficient for their purposes. Your sympathy for these mammals has clouded your judgment, old one, Krethix replied. Watch, and see how the collective handles threats. The Kresh fleet that departed for Concordia was indeed 300 ships strong, and included some of the most powerful vessels in assembly space. They expected to find the human fleet attempting to flee, or perhaps dug into defensive positions around the station. What they found instead was humanity's answer to the question of how 60 ships could challenge an empire The human fleet had split into smaller wolf packs that prowled the outer system. With predatory patience, when the Kresh fleet entered weapons range expecting a conventional engagement, the humans instead unleashed tactics that the assembly had not seen. In millennia cyber warfare packages, infiltrated Kresh command networks and turned automated systems against their operators' kinetic kill vehicles launched from beyond visual range and struck with relativistic speeds that energy shields could not stop mine. Fields deployed during combat turned space itself into a weapon. Kresh fleet's numerical advantage meant nothing when their ships started firing on each other due to compromised targeting system. Skrethix watched in horror from his flagship as the formation disintegrated into chaos. Human ships danced through the wreckage with impossible agility and struck again and again at vulnerable points that no honorable opponent would target. They destroyed communications, arrays to isolate ships from the fleet, and then picked them off one by one. They broadcast the dying screams of Kresh crews on open channels to break the morale of survivors. They refused every offer of honorable surrender and instead showed the same merciless efficiency that humanity had once used to dominate Earth's food chain when a Kresh destroyer tried to ram a damaged human frigate. The humans simply let it come and then detonated their reactor at the moment of impact. The explosion took out 3 more Kresh ships, and the humans never even tried to evacuate their crew. Skrethix finally understood what Keeper Theln had tried to warn them about. These were not civilized beings who fought according to accepted conventions of warfare. These were apex predators who had spent 10,000 years fighting each other for dominance of a death world and who brought every savage lesson learned to the stars. All ships retreat, Skrethix ordered in panic. Fall back to the assembly point and regroup. The humans did not allow an orderly retreat. They harried the fleeing Kresh ships like wolves, chasing wounded prey, and destroyed every vessel that fell behind. By the time the survivors reached the edge of the system, they had lost over 200 ships to humanity's 60. Except humanity had not lost 60 ships. The human fleet that emerged from the battle had been reduced to 43 vessels, and every single one showed battle damage. But Kowalski's message suggested that losses meant nothing to his people. The Kresh Collective has failed to meet our demands. He transmitted, "We are therefore expanding operations." This was one ambassador, he said, and his voice carried the promise of terrible vengeance. "We have 8 billion more where she came from. Choose wisely." The transmission ended, and the luminary's sensors detected new faster-than-light signatures appearing throughout assembly space. More human fleets were arriving, and these were even larger than the first Earth. They had not sent everything they had to Concordia. They had sent enough to prove a point, and now they were following up with the full weight of human industrial might. Assembly faced a choice that no galactic power had confronted in 3,000 years. They could fight and possibly win through sheer weight of numbers, but the cost would be catastrophic, and the humans had made it clear they would make every victory as expensive as possible, or they could negotiate with an enemy who had proven they could bleed the assembly white even in defeat. For the first time in its long history, the Galactic Assembly was affrayed across the galaxy on 1,000 conquered worlds. The subject species watched and wondered if perhaps humanity had just changed everything. Keeper Theln sat alone in his quarters and watched the battle reports with sad satisfaction. He had warned them that humans were different, but no one had listened. Now they would learn the hard way. What happened when you murdered someone's ambassador and expected them to simply accept it? The old Archon pulled up a private channel and recorded a message to Admiral Kowalski. "Admiral," he said, "my name is Keeper Theln, and I was a friend to Ambassador Vasquez. I cannot undo what was done to her, but I can help you ensure that her death means something. Let us talk about how to break an empire." The battle that would later be known as the Concordia Massacre expanded across 3 star systems over the course of 5 brutal days. Assembly had finally mobilized its full military might, with thousands of ships converging on human positions. From every corner of their territory, the Luminari contributed 800 crystalline warships whose energy weapons could slice through most known armor. Sorix deployed 600 of their heavy assault carriers loaded with shock troops, bred specifically for boarding actions. The Kresh Collective, despite their losses, sent another 500 vessels with crews driven by fury at their previous humiliation Against this overwhelming force, Admiral Kowalski had 200 human ships, divided into independent battle groups that operated with terrifying coordination. The assembly expected the humans to retreat or to dig in around defensible positions, but once again, humanity refused to fight according to civilized conventions. Human wolfpacks struck at logistics convoys and support vessels rather than engaging capital ships directly. Deployed autonomous drone swarms that learned enemy tactics in real time and adapted faster than biological crews could respond. They used gravity well generators to trap entire formations in local space-time distortions and then bombarded them with weapons that the assembly's scientists insisted were theoretically impossible. The luminaries' crystalline hulls, which had been thought invulnerable to kinetic weapons, shattered under the impact of human railgun rounds. Traveling at significant fractions of light speed, the Sorix boarding parties found themselves facing human marines in close quarters combat and discovered why. Apex predators dominate in confined spaces. Lieutenant Sarah Chen led one such boarding defense on the cruiser. Defiant and her helmet camera footage would later become required viewing at every human military academy. The Sorix came through the breached hull with overwhelming numbers and absolute confidence in their physical superiority. They were larger than humans, stronger, and their scales could turn aside most blade weapons. But Sarah Chen and her marines fought with a controlled savagery that exploited every weakness in Sorix biology. They targeted eye clusters with precision shooting and used shaped charges to crack scales at vulnerable joint areas. When ammunition ran low, they switched to vibro weapons and fought in the tight corridors where Sorix size became a disadvantage. Chen herself killed 17 enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before a Sorix warlord finally cornered her in an ammunition depot. The warlord was twice her size with claws that could tear through steel and scales that had turned aside a dozen human rounds. Chan's response was to trigger the depot's self-destruct. While locking the warlord in an embrace that prevented escape, the explosion killed them both, along with 30 more Sorix soldiers, and sealed the breach that had threatened the entire ship. Captain Marcus Rodriguez, who commanded the Defiant, watched the footage with tears streaming down his face, and then ordered his crew to make every death count when the Sorix tried to retreat from the Defiant. Rodriguez had his ship pursue them and used the last of his missiles to destroy their assault carrier. The pattern repeated across every engagement. Human ships that were crippled and unable to retreat simply detonated their reactors and took enemy vessels with them. Human crews cut off from their ships fought to the last person and made the enemy pay in blood for every corridor. Human commanders used tactics that the assembly found incomprehensible and horrifying in equal measure. Admiral Kowalski's flagship Elena's Vengeance led the main human battle group in a running fight with the Kresh fleet that lasted 48 hours. The Kresh had learned from their first encounter and now fought with more caution, but the humans had adapted as well. Kowalski deployed a new weapon that the human scientists had been developing in secret. Artificial intelligence-guided missiles that could outthink enemy point defense systems. Missiles were small and fast, and they learned from every interception attempt by the MCO. The end of the first day, they had achieved a 70% hit rate that climbed to 90% by day 2. The Kresh fleet started taking catastrophic losses, and Hive Lord Krethix finally accepted that his collective could not win this engagement. All forces pull back to the assembly point. He ordered, "We will consolidate and strike at their supply lines." But the humans had anticipated this strategy and had positioned a second battle group along the Kresh retreat route. The trap closed with mechanical precision, and the Kresh found themselves caught between two human forces with no avenue of escape. Made a decision that would haunt the assembly. For generations, he ordered every ship under his command to activate their faster-than-light drive simultaneously regardless of safety protocols. The massive space-time distortion that resulted was visible across half the sector, and it did allow some Kresh ships to escape, but it also destroyed nearly 200 vessels in catastrophic drive failures and created a temporary rift in local space that would take years to stabilize. The Luminari fared slightly better through superior technology and disciplined retreat, but they too learned hard lessons about human warfare. Their energy shields, which could absorb massive amounts of directed energy, proved useless against human kinetic weapons there. long-range engagement doctrine, which relied on destroying enemies before they could close to combat range, failed against human ships that simply accepted losses to get within strike distance. Their commanders, who had studied warfare for centuries, found themselves outmaneuvered by human officers who adapted to battlefield conditions with frightening speed, crystalline-mind-who-sees-far, analyzed the tactical data, and reached a conclusion that shook the Luminari High Council. They are not fighting to win. He reported, "They are fighting to teach us that victory against them will cost more than we are willing to pay." The Sorix military command reached a similar conclusion. But from a different perspective, General Bloodscale had personally led boarding actions against 3 human vessels and had survived only because his subordinates dragged him to safety. "They fight like Sorix," he told his assembled generals. "No, they fight better than Sorix because they add cunning to ferocity. We have treated them as prey, but they are fellow hunters," continued, "and hunters should not waste energy fighting each other when there are so many prey species." To share the suggestion that the Sorix might ally with humans rather than fight them sent shockwaves through the assembly. The 5th day of combat, Admiral Kowalski's fleet had been reduced to 73 operational vessels from the original 200, but the assembly had lost over 1,500 ships with thousands more damaged beyond immediate repair. Mathematics were brutal and undeniable, and in defeat the humans had inflicted losses that would take the assembly years to replace. An intelligence report suggested that Earth's shipyards were producing new vessels at a rate that should have been impossible. "Where are they getting the resources?" demanded a Luminari counselor. "Our projections showed that human industrial capacity could not support this level of production." Keeper Theln, who had been quietly sharing information with the humans throughout the conflict, finally spoke up. "They are using every asteroid, every moon, every scrap of material in their territory," explained. "And they are doing it with an efficiency that we abandoned millennia ago when we became comfortable with our dominance. More importantly," he added, "they are doing it with the full support of their population, something the assembly has never achieved." The truth was that human civilians had volunteered in numbers that boggled. Assembly understanding factory workers put in 16-hour shifts and refused overtime. Pay scientists shared research freely rather than hoarding it for personal glory. Even children contributed by growing food in hydroponic gardens and collecting recyclables for the war effort. It was a total societal mobilization of a type that peaceful civilizations had forgotten was possible, and it terrified the assembly because they realized that even if they won this war, the costs would destabilize their entire civilization. The breaking point came when Admiral Kowalski transmitted a new message after the 5th day of combat. "We have demonstrated that we can bleed you," he said simply. "We have shown that even destroying us will cost you your empire, but we are not unreasonable," he continued. "We did not come here to conquer your worlds or enslave your people. We came for justice. Meet our demands, and this ends now," Kowalski stated. "Refuse, and we will burn through your territory, teaching every oppressed species our tactics until the galaxy is consumed by war." The transmission included detailed footage of human Marines training soldiers from conquered assembly species. Subject populations who had been watching the conflict with desperate hope were now learning human warfare. The assembly's worst nightmare was coming true. Even if they destroyed humanity, they would face 100 rebellions led by species who had learned that the assembly could be hurt. Keeper Theln stood before the assembly council and delivered the final truth they needed to hear. "You wanted to know if humanity would submit like the others," he said. "You have your answer. The question now is whether you will have an empire left after you finish trying to conquer them." The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session for the first time in 800 years in the chamber that had once echoed with confident declarations of superiority. Now rang with desperate arguments. The Kresh Collective was in ruins, with their fleet reduced to barely 300 operational vessels in their territory, facing rebellions from a dozen subject species who had watched them bleed the Luminari. Calculated probabilities with crystalline precision in every simulation showed the same result. Continuing the war with humanity would cost them more than they could afford. The Sorix had quietly begun sending diplomatic feelers to act Earth through back channels because General Bloodscale had convinced his leadership that humans would make Better allies than enemies, only a handful of minor assembly members still called for total war, and even they fell silent when Keeper Theln presented the intelligence reports. Humanity has deployed 16 new battle groups in the past week, he announced. Their industrial output has tripled since the conflict began, and shows no signs of slowing more critically. He continued. 73 subject species have now made contact with human forces requesting military training and support. The chamber erupted into panicked chittering, chiming, and hissing. For 3,000 years, the assembly had maintained control through the threat of overwhelming force and the carefully cultivated belief that resistance was futile. Humanity had shattered that belief in less than a month of combat. We must negotiate, declared crystalline-mind-who-sees-far. The mathematics are undeniable. We cannot win this war without destroying ourselves in the process. Negotiation is surrender, shrieked one of the junior Kresh Hive Lords. Surrender is what you will be offering when human fleets occupy your breeding worlds. Keeper Theln replied coldly. Negotiation is what you do when you still have something to bargain with. The vote to authorize peace talks passed with 70% support, and Keeper Theln volunteered to serve as the assembly's
chief negotiator.
Response to the peace overture was swift and uncompromising. They would negotiate with the assembly, but only under specific conditions. First, all talks would be held in neutral space, with human security forces providing protections. The assembly would immediately cease all military operations and pull back their forces to defensive positions. Third, individuals responsible for Ambassador Vasquez's murder would be placed in human custody pending trial. Assembly agreed to the first two conditions immediately, but balked at the third. We cannot simply hand over our military commanders, protested a Luminary counselor. It would undermine the entire command structure. Director Sarah Chen, who had been appointed Earth's chief negotiator, fixed the counselor with a stare that reminded everyone present that she had lost her sister. At Concordia, you murdered our ambassador during a diplomatic mission, she said quietly. You then attempted to cover up that murder with lies and false apologies. The only reason we are talking instead of burning your worlds is because we want to build something better than what you have created, Chen continued. But make no mistake, justice for our dead is not negotiable. Keeper Theln stepped in before the talks could collapse. The assembly will comply. He announced to the shock of the other delegates, we will surrender all individuals involved in planning or executing the Concordia incident. You cannot speak for the entire assembly. The Kresh delegate buzzed furiously. I can and I do, Theln replied. Because I am the only one here who seems to understand that this is not a negotiation about terms. It is a negotiation about whether the assembly will continue to exist. The old Archon's words carried weight, and after several more hours of argument, the assembly delegates finally agreed. 14 Kresh commanders, 3 Sorix generals, and 2 Luminari intelligence directors were turned over to human custody. The TRIALS were held aboard a human space station, with assembly observers allowed to monitor the proceedings. Director Chen personally prosecuted the case, and the evidence she presented was overwhelming. Every communication, every order, every moment of the attack on the human quarters had been recorded by Ambassador Vasquez's quantum transmitter. The defendants had no defense, and the assembly delegates who watched found themselves confronting the reality of what their government had done. The verdicts came down unanimously guilty, and the sentences were severe there. Then execution, which would have made martyrs of the convicted. The humans sentenced them to life imprisonment on a penal colony designated as New Siberia. The colony was located on a frozen moon where the prisoners would spend their days working to terraform the environment into something habitable. You wanted to reshape the galaxy in your image, Chen told them at sentencing. Now you will reshape a world with your own hands, and perhaps learn the value of building rather than destroying. With justice served, the real negotiations could begin. Earth's demands went far beyond simple reparations. They wanted a complete restructuring of the assembly to prevent future atrocities. Every member species would have equal voting rights. Regardless of their military strengths, species would be given the choice to gain full independence or full membership. With no middle ground of subjugation, the assembly's military would be reduced to a defensive force with strict limitations on offensive capabilities. most radically. Humanity demanded the creation of an independent tribunal with the authority to investigate and prosecute war crimes committed by any Assembly member, including founding members. The Assembly delegates resisted every point, and the negotiations dragged on 4 months. But every time they tried to water down humanity's demands, Director, Chen would simply pull up casualty reports from human ships and ask if they wanted to continue the discussion through military means, instead slowly and painfully. The Assembly agreed to each demand. The restructuring began with the liberation of subject species, and the chaos that resulted nearly tore the galaxy apart. Rebellions erupted across Assembly space as populations that had been suppressed for centuries suddenly saw an opportunity for freedom. The Kresh Collective fractured into a dozen independent hive states that immediately went to war with each other. Luminari lost half their territory as former colonies declared independence. The Sorcs, surprisingly, weathered the storm better than most by quickly offering genuine partnership to their subject species rather than trying to maintain control through force. Humanity deployed peacekeeping forces to the worst conflict zones, but made it clear they would not impose order through conquest. We fought to give you the freedom to choose your own path, Admiral Kowalski told a gathering of newly independent species. What you do with that freedom is up to you. It took 5 years for the new galactic order to stabilize them. Old Assembly was reformed as the Galactic Coalition with Earth holding a permanent seat on the Security Council alongside the Archons, Sorcs, and a reformed Luminari collective. The Kresh were denied membership until they could demonstrate they had abandoned their expansionist ideology. Species were actually invited to join as equals, and for the first time in galactic history. The invitation was genuine. Trade flourished as human technology spread across the galaxy, and barriers that the old Assembly had maintained to control member species came down. Human medical science extended the lifespans of a dozen species in human. Engineering helped terraform worlds that had been deemed uninhabitable. But humanity also shared something more important than technology. They shared the concept that no species had the right to dominate another, and that strength should be used to protect the weak rather than exploit them. The dedication of the Ambassador Elena Vasquez Memorial Station took place on the 10th anniversary of the Concordia incident. The station was built from the salvaged remains of the old Assembly outpost, and it served as the new Coalition headquarters. Keeper Theln, who had lived to see the transformation he had helped create, spoke at the dedication ceremony. 10 years ago, the Assembly murdered an ambassador because she refused to submit to our authority. He said, "We expected humanity to accept this as the price of dealing with greater powers. Instead, humanity taught us that there are no greater powers. Only those who are willing to fight for what they believe in, and those who are not." Ambassador Vasquez came to us offering friendship, and we killed her for it, Theln continued. But her death became the seed from which a better galaxy grew. Director Sarah Chen unveiled the memorial plaque that would stand at the station's entrance forever. Bore Ambassador Vasquez's last words. Don't let them get away with it. She told us not to let them get away with it, Chen said, and we didn't. Made sure that her death meant something, and that no other species would face the same fate. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for all those who had fallen in the brief but terrible war at 10,000. Humans had died in the conflict along with over 200,000 Assembly personnel, but their sacrifice had purchased freedom for billions and had created a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than domination. As the attendees dispersed, Keeper Theln found himself standing beside General Bloodscale, who now served as the Sorcs ambassador to the Coalition. Tell me, old friend, Bloodscale asked, do you think humanity knew what they were starting when they refused to submit? Theln considered the question carefully.